You know, normally when someone lands this massive career-defining job, especially in a highly specialized field, there's a pretty standard script for how that plays out.
Oh, for sure. You sign the contract, you do the little happy dance in your kitchen.
Right. And then you immediately pick up your phone and you call your mom.
Yeah, that is the classic first phone call.
Exactly. I mean, you want to share that validation, right? You want to share the success with your family.
Because it's supposed to be this, universal moment of celebration. You're bringing your family in on a milestone you've presumably been working toward for years.
Right. But then you step into the world of highly polarized modern European politics, and suddenly that entirely normal script just gets thrown completely out the window.
Yeah, it completely vanishes.
It really does.
Huh.
So today, in this deep dive, we are looking at a situation where a highly successful fiscal lawyer makes this massive career leap, right?
Yeah.
And her very first instinct is actually to hide it from her own mother.
Wow. Yeah, that's heavy.
Right. She actively conceals her new job. And, she doesn't hide it because she's doing something illegal or anything like that.
No, of course not.
She hides it because she knows the sheer social weight of the political party she just joined. She knows it's going to trigger this immediate, potentially explosive reaction within her own family.
And, that signals immediately that we are dealing with something far heavier than just, a simple pivot in a career trajectory.
Definitely.
We are talking about crossing a societal threshold that carries just immense friction.
So true. So today, we are unpacking the source of that exact friction. We are taking a deep dive into a very specific, highly debated primary source.
Which is fascinating, by the way.
It is. It's a translated transcript from a Dutch-language YouTube interview. The channel is called Crockpraat, and the guest is Francesca Van Belleghem.
Right.
And for those who don't know, she is a parliament member for the right-wing Flemish Nationalist Party in Belgium, which is called Vlaams Belang.
And, before we really get into the architecture of her arguments here, we need to set a very firm boundary for you, the listener.
Yes, absolutely critical.
We have to state right up front, we are not endorsing any political viewpoints presented in this source material, period.
None at all.
Whether they are left-wing, right-wing, or anywhere in between. That is not what we do.
Exactly. We want to be crystal clear about that. Our sole mission in this deep dive is to neutrally convey, decode, and basically analyze the argument.
Yeah, the data points, the perspectives.
Right, exactly as they appear in this provided text. We aren't taking sides here.
We are just acting as your guides, to help you understand what is actually being said in this specific cultural and political artifact. We're going to take it apart and see how the gears turn.
Because, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, what makes this source so incredibly useful to study isn't just the political stance itself.
No, it's the underlying mechanics.
Right. It's how she constructs these arguments about demographics and the structural integrity of the welfare state.
And that very specific framing of cultural values, which honestly often go entirely unspoken in mainstream media discourse.
Totally. It is a really raw window into a specific worldview that is currently driving a massive amount of political momentum across Europe.
It really is. So, let's start with the human element.
Good idea.
Because you really can't understand the policy until you understand the psychology of the person pushing it, right?
Right. You need that context. So we have this core tension right out of the gate. Francesca Van Belleghem is a fiscal lawyer. She's got a master's degree in law.
She's navigating a complex, lucrative, highly respected field.
And then, boom, she just drops it.
Yeah.
She leaves that stable, predictable career to join what is arguably one of the most controversial political parties in the country.
And she explicitly notes in the interview that she didn't come from what she calls a Flemish nationalist nest.
Oh, yeah, that term.
Yeah, she says her upbringing was completely apolitical.
So unpack that nest detail for us, because that feels like crucial context for understanding Belgian society, right?
It really is. So historically, Belgium has been a heavily pillarized society.
Okay, pillarized. What does that mean in practice?
Basically, it means that traditionally you were born into a specific socio-political pillar, like the Catholic pillar, the socialist pillar, the liberal pillar.
Yeah.
And you went to the schools associated with that pillar. You joined their trade unions. You read their specific newspapers.
It was your whole world.
Exactly. So to say she doesn't come from a nationalist nest means she wasn't grandfathered into this ideology.
Right. It wasn't just ambient inner childhood home.
No, she arrived at it entirely independently, which, implies a very specific catalyst.
And she actually outlines that catalyst really clearly in the interview. And it's deeply personal. It's essentially twofold.
Right.
First, she describes her own experiences as a young woman going out at night. She claims she was constantly harassed on the street by men, and she specifically notes that these men were of foreign origin.
So she has this sort of baseline of anxiety built up.
Yeah, exactly. But she says the true tipping point, like the thing that pushed her from just passive irritation to actually dropping her legal career to run for office, was becoming a mother.
Yeah, that changes everything.
It does. She says, quote, "Ideologically, I just want a better future for my children."
And that is a really powerful rhetorical framing.
How so?
Because it shifts the motivation away from like abstract political ambition and it grounds it in this primal protective instinct.
Like mama bear energy.
Exactly. She is basically arguing that she looked at the trajectory of her environment, she assessed the physical safety and the economic future for her kids, and determined that the current power structures were completely incapable of securing that future.
Right. The crisis felt so urgent to her that just maintaining her comfortable, apolitical life felt like, I don't know, a dereliction of duty as a parent.
But stepping out of that comfortable life comes with a massive cost. Which brings us right back to her hiding the job from her mom.
Yes, the harness. She uses this very specific psychological concept to describe the environment she was living in before she made the leap.
Right, the Kurzleaf in Dutch.
Yeah. She talks about eventually having to look in the mirror and basically tell herself, Francesca, free yourself from that harness you were in.
And she extrapolates that personal feeling to her party's voters, too.
She does. She suggests that anyone who votes for or joins Vlaams Belang has to actively, painfully break out of this heavy, restrictive harness of societal prejudice and media stigma.
And the sociology of that harness metaphor is just profound.
Tell me more about that.
Well, think about what a harness does. It's designed to restrict movement, right? To force you to conform to a specific posture, to keep you tethered safely to the main structure.
Yeah, to keep you in line.
Exactly. So by using that word, she is describing a society where the mainstream political consensus is enforced not just by laws, but by intense, informal social pressure.
Which is often way stronger than the law.
It really is. Breaking from it isn't just, checking a different box on a ballot. It requires accepting that you will become a pariah in certain circles.
Potentially even within your own family, like she feared.
Right. It really speaks to this phenomenon of the political closet.
I'm just trying to visualize the sheer weight of that friction. It's like, okay, imagine you're on a perfectly safe, highly regimented luxury cruise ship.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
We have a great cabin. The buffet is always open. Everyone agrees on the itinerary. It's great.
Sounds lovely.
But then you become utterly convinced that the ship has a hole in the hull and is slowly sinking, even though the captain is on the loudspeaker saying, hey, folks, everything is totally fine.
Right.
So you make the decision to jump off that luxury liner and literally swim over to a pirate ship that is actively navigating a hurricane.
Oh, wow.
Just because they're the only ones yelling about the hole in the hull. You are taking a massive social and professional hit. Why put yourself through that?
Well, you put yourself through that if you genuinely believe the math dictates that the luxury liner is going to be at the bottom of the ocean in 20 years.
The math, right.
Yeah. And that is exactly where she pivots in the interview. She moves away from the qualitative, emotional arguments like motherhood and street harassment, and she anchors her entire worldview in cold, hard mathematics.
She goes straight to demographics.
Exactly.
Yeah, she actually mentions that she is quite fond of working in Excel spreadsheets.
Of course, the fiscal lawyer loves Excel.
Right. So let's look at her spreadsheet. She claims that the Flemish birth rate is currently hovering around like 1.6 or 1.7.
And to understand the gravity of that number, we really need to explain demographic momentum to the listener.
Please do.
So the replacement level fertility rate, which is the exact number of children needed for a population to just replace itself from one generation to the next, is 2.1.
Right, accounting for infant mortality and people who just don't have kids.
Exactly. So when you drop to 1.6, you aren't just experiencing a slight dip, you are entering a structural contraction.
Meaning every subsequent generation is significantly smaller than the last one.
Yes.
And because populations compound, kind of like interest in a bank account, but in reverse, a sustained rate of 1.6 leads to this inverted population pyramid.
Right, where you end up with a massive cohort of elderly people at the top and this rapidly shrinking base of young people at the bottom.
It's top-heavy.
Very. And Francesca takes this baseline data point, this 1.6, and projects it forward.
Okay, what's her projection?
According to her calculations in the interview, if current trends continue, by the year 2044, barely half of the population will actually be of Flemish origin.
Barely half. Wow.
Yeah, she asserts that the native Flemish population is actively shrinking, and the only reason the overall population of the country is growing at all is entirely due to migration.
Okay, wait. I need to challenge the certainty of that spreadsheet for a second.
Sure.
We're talking about projecting demographic trends 20 years into the future.
Yeah.
Pandemics happen, economic booms and busts happen, housing policies change. How can she definitively point to 2044 and say, this is the exact math of our demographic reality? I mean, isn't there a ton of elasticity in those models?
Well, there is elasticity in things like short-term migration flows or, minor economic shifts. But the core of demographic modeling is actually surprisingly rigid.
Really? Why is that?
Because the people who are going to be having children in 20 years have already been born.
Right.
You can't suddenly invent a missing generation of 25-year-olds. The structural decay she is pointing to at a 1.6 birth rate is basically baked into the cake right now.
Wow, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, her argument is that this isn't some speculative theory. It's a mathematical inevitability based on the current headcount.
And she couples this demographic anxiety with a very stark, very aggressive economic claim.
She does.
She flat out states that Belgium is bankrupt.
Yeah.
She says the country has no money left, that it is essentially living off inherited wealth from past generations of economic productivity.
Right, and that this historical wealth is rapidly being depleted by inflation and structural deficits.
Exactly.
And this is where we really need to unpack the actual mechanics of a Western European welfare state, because it is the central pillar of her economic grievance.
So how does that model actually work structurally?
A welfare state, whether it's the Belgian model, the Nordic model, whatever, operates on a high-tax, high-service social contract.
Okay.
The citizens agree to hand over a massive percentage of their income, often 40, 50, sometimes over 50% when you factor in all the social contributions.
Which is huge.
It is. But in return, the state guarantees heavily subsidized health care, robust unemployment benefits, nearly free higher education, and extensive pensions.
It's a beautifully designed system in theory, but it relies on a very delicate equilibrium.
Exactly.
It requires a massive, highly productive base of taxpayers constantly paying into the system to fund the people who are currently drawing from it.
Right. It is essentially an ongoing intergenerational transfer of wealth.
And Francesca argues that this equilibrium has just been destroyed.
Yes.
Her core thesis here is a profound incompatibility. She argues that you cannot combine a heavily subsidized, generous welfare state with open borders and mass migration.
So, to use an analogy, her argument is that a welfare state is essentially like a high-end, all-inclusive resort.
Okay, I like this.
And the original members pay a massive monthly fee for this resort. The buffet is incredible, the medical staff is on call, the infrastructure is pristine.
Sounds like a great resort.
But if you open the gates and allow thousands of people to enter the resort who haven't paid that exorbitant membership fee, and you allow them to eat at the same buffet and use the same doctors, the resort's budget collapses. The food runs out, the infrastructure degrades, and the original members who are paying for it all end up footing a massive deficit.
That is precisely her framework. She compares the country to a business running a structural deficit.
Right.
Like, you can survive a bad quarter, maybe even a bad year, by dipping into your reserves, which she calls the inherited wealth. But if your business model mathematically guarantees that you spend more than you take in every single season because your client base is utilizing services without generating equivalent revenue,
eventually the business just collapses.
Exactly. But, I'm looking at this economic claim, and it feels like there is a massive, gaping counter-argument here that mainstream economists bring up all the time.
Oh, absolutely. The aging workforce argument.
Right. Basic macroeconomics tells us that Western Europe has an aging crisis. We just discussed the inverted population pyramid.
Yeah.
We have all these retirees drawing pensions, and not enough young native Flemings to pay the taxes to support them.
Right.
So if the economy literally needs young workers to survive, isn't stopping immigration entirely just a different kind of economic suicide?
That's the big question.
I mean, isn't she just accelerating the exact bankruptcy she's trying to avoid by cutting off the supply of new taxpayers?
Well, that is the standard economic justification for migration in Europe. And she addresses it directly in the source material by calling that logic kicking the hot potato down the road.
Okay, kicking the hot potato. How does she rebut it? Let's hear how she squares that circle.
Well, she provides a twofold rebuttal. First, she points out a very simple biological reality that is often glossed over in short-term economic projections.
Which is?
Migrants age too.
Right, yeah.
If you bring in a 25-year-old worker today to pay for a 70-year-old's pension, in 40 years, that migrant will be 65.
And then you will need an even larger cohort of new migrants to pay for their pension.
Exactly, creating this endless, escalating Ponzi scheme of demographic dependency.
Okay, that addresses the long-term timeline, the 40-year horizon. But what about the immediate fiscal impact? Surely someone working and paying taxes today is a net positive right now.
And this is where her second rebuttal comes in, and it relies on a specific study she cites in the interview. She references a study commissioned by the NBA.
Okay, and just for context for the listener, the N-VA, or the New Flemish Alliance, is a mainstream center-right Flemish nationalist party in Belgium.
Right.
They are essentially a more moderate establishment rival to her party, Vlaams Belang.
Exactly. So she is citing a study from a rival party to validate her point, which is an interesting rhetorical move.
Definitely. What did the study say?
According to her summary of his study, the data revealed that only a very specific, narrow demographic of migrants actually make a net positive financial contribution to the state treasury over their life cycle in the country.
Really? Which demographic?
Specifically, highly educated labor migrants from Western countries.
So, meaning like an engineer from Germany or an IT specialist from the United States who comes in on a high salary, pays that 50% tax rate, and doesn't rely heavily on social housing or subsidies.
Exactly. She claims the study shows that many other forms of labor migration, and especially asylum migration or family reunification, actually form a structural cost.
Structural cost.
Yeah. When you factor in the cost of integration courses, language classes, subsidized housing, schooling for their children, and healthcare utilization.
They basically consume more in-state resources than they contribute in taxes.
Right. So her argument is that the current type of mass migration isn't saving the welfare state at all. It is actively accelerating its bankruptcy by adding more liabilities to the ledger than assets.
Wow. I mean, that is a deeply cynical, purely utilitarian way to view human movement. It entirely strips away the humanitarian aspect and basically reduces people to their net tax value.
It is entirely macroeconomic. She is treating the state treasury as a closed system that is currently, in her view, bleeding out.
But, the source material doesn't start in economics and spreadsheets.
No, it doesn't.
It actually shifts gears into something much more visceral and much harder to quantify, and that's culture.
Because if the demographics are shifting as rapidly as her 2044 projection claims, the natural question is, what happens to the culture on the ground as the population changes?
Right. And she introduces this section by advocating for the preservation of what she calls Christian values.
Now, in modern, highly secularized Western Europe, invoking Christian values can sound almost, anachronistic.
Yeah, a bit outdated.
But what is fascinating here, and what requires careful analysis from us, is how she practically defines that term when pressed.
Yes, because the interviewer actually pushes her on this. He essentially asks, what do Christian values even mean to a 20-something in Flanders today who hasn't been to church in a decade?
And she doesn't respond with strict theological dogma at all.
No. She doesn't mandate Sunday Mass or biblical literalism. She provides a highly specific, very modern definition. She says, for her, Christian values mean equality between men and women.
Which is a remarkable rhetorical maneuver.
Yeah, it really is.
She is essentially using the historical legacy of Christian values as a proxy for the entire trajectory of the Western Enlightenment, liberal freedoms, and modern gender equality. She is arguing that the society they live in slowly evolved over centuries to create this free, fair system with genuine equality between genders.
And she is contrasting this native evolution with what she sees as imported cultures, where, in her explicit words, women are treated as second-class citizens.
Yeah.
It feels like a massive bait-and-switch in political terminology, doesn't it?
Completely.
She is basically taking the progressive winds of the last 50 years, women's liberation, gender equality, and claiming them as conservative, traditional values that need to be aggressively defended from outsiders.
Yeah.
She literally says that if you don't appreciate those Christian values now, you will certainly miss them when they're gone.
And to illustrate this feeling of cultural erosion, she uses a very specific, seemingly small cultural touchstone: the Christmas market.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
She talks about the growing phenomenon in European cities of renaming traditional Christmas markets to winter markets.
Right.
And she argues this isn't just an innocent rebrand. She sees it as a deliberate linguistic erasure designed to avoid offending people from other non-Christian cultures.
She points out a perceived hypocrisy in this dynamic, too. She argues that this respect, this cultural concession, is entirely one-sided.
How so?
She feels the native historical culture is constantly being asked to dilute itself, to concede its traditions and its nomenclature, without ever receiving the same level of deference or integration in return from the newly arrived cultures.
Which creates a profound sense of alienation in your own hometown.
Exactly.
And this sense of alienation, this feeling of native culture being forced to accommodate imported conservatism, leads us to what might be the most complex and honestly surprising argument in the entire source material.
It is a massive political inversion.
It really is.
Huh?
Because we typically associate the defense of progressive social rights, like LGBTQ+ rights and women's physical safety, with left-wing progressive politics.
That has been the historical alignment for decades.
Right. But Francesca argues that the traditional left wing is actually importing the greatest threat to those very rights through their support of mass migration.
It's what we might call the LGBTQ plus paradox within modern European right-wing nationalism.
Let's break that down.
Well, in the interview, she explicitly addresses the widespread accusation that her party, Vlaams Belang, is fundamentally anti-LGBTQ plus sex. And she flatly denies it.
Really?
Yes. She states on the record, quote, "We think all the rights of LGBTQ plus people, as they are now, are good. Everything is fine, and we think everything should be preserved."
Wait, really? A traditionalist right-wing nationalist party is saying the current state of LGBTQ+ rights is perfect and needs to be protected.
That is what she claims.
How does a conservative party even square that? That seems wildly contradictory to traditional conservative platforms.
Well, she squares it by changing the primary antagonist.
Okay.
She isn't fighting against progressive social policies anymore. She is fighting against imported ultra-conservatism.
Ah, I see the pivot.
She cites a recent highly publicized violent incident where a 14 or 15-year-old boy was beaten up, heavily implying it was a homophobic attack. And she claims that if you look at the reality on the streets, the perpetrators in these types of violent attacks are very often individuals from a Muslim background.
But, she argues, pointing out that demographic reality immediately gets you labeled a racist by the mainstream media and the left.
Exactly. She basically accuses left-wing parties of having blinders on.
She argues that it is entirely contradictory, almost schizophrenic, for a political movement to claim to be the ultimate champion of LGBTQ+ rights, while simultaneously advocating for open borders and mass migration from deeply conservative, highly religious cultures.
Cultures that are, in her view, actively hostile to those very rights.
So she is positioning her right-wing nationalist party not as a regressive force trying to roll back the clock on social rights, but as the ultimate necessary shield for those progressive values.
Yeah. She is arguing that without strict borders, the liberal tolerance of the West will simply be weaponized against it by intolerant imported cultures.
Wow. And she applies this exact same logic, this exact same mechanism of threat to women's rights and the physical safety of women on the streets.
Which, if you remember, was her original catalyst.
Exactly. Which leads into a very fraught discussion in the interview about the manosphere and modern gender dynamics.
Yeah, the podcast hosts bring up the current media narratives surrounding masculinity. They suggest that men are often painted with a broad, negative brush in contemporary culture. The whole idea of toxic masculinity.
And Francesca actually agrees with this assessment to a large extent. She states that while the world used to heavily favor men, she feels the pendulum has swung so far that it now heavily favors women.
She even admits, which is honestly rare for a politician, that she feels she has been advantaged in her own career simply for being a young woman.
Right, and she dislikes that. She says she wants to be judged solely on her merit, on her capabilities as a lawyer and a politician, not elevated to fill a diversity quota or because it looks good for the party image.
She argues that modern men are currently put on the defensive in society. She says they are presumed guilty until proven innocent, that a man can be ostracized just for looking at someone for too long.
She talks about testosterone levels dropping globally and men losing their sense of identity and purpose in a society that constantly tells them their natural instincts are problematic.
But here is the fascinating tension I'm seeing in her argument.
What's that?
Well, on one hand, she is critiquing modern feminism and acknowledging the defensive, suppressed posture of modern men. But on the other hand, she immediately circles back to the physical danger women face on the streets.
Right, the very street harassment that catalyzed her political career in the first place.
Exactly. She wants men to be bold, to be protectors, but she just admitted society punishes them for it.
Yes, and she explicitly connects those two thoughts. She argues that because Native men have been so heavily conditioned to fear social or legal repercussions, because they are terrified of being labeled aggressive or toxic, they are now too afraid to step in and defend women who are being harassed in public.
They freeze.
They freeze. And she traces the source of that street-level danger, the harassment that Native men are too afraid to stop, right back to her core thesis, the importation of people who do not share Western norms.
She claims that women are facing real physical danger from men imported from countries where women are considered second-class citizens.
And she points to the overrepresentation of foreign nationals in statistics regarding sexual offenses to back up her claim.
She's basically saying we neutered our own men through progressive social pressure, and then we imported men who don't respect women, leaving women entirely unprotected.
It is a sweeping, intensely interconnected narrative.
It really is.
She has built this architecture of cascading crises. You have a demographic time bomb that mathematically guarantees Native replacement, a bankrupt welfare state collapsing under the weight of non-contributing dependents, and a culture where Native traditions are erased and progressive rights are threatened by the very people the political left insists on welcoming.
That sums it up perfectly.
So, okay, if all of this is true, if this is the absolute unvarnished reality on the ground as she sees it, and the math backs it up and the street reality confirms it, the obvious glaring question for the listener is, why isn't everyone talking about it?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. Why isn't this the lead story on the nightly news every single day? If the ship is sinking, why is the band still playing?
And this is exactly where the source transitions from analyzing the problems to critiquing the systemic forces that prevent those problems from being solved.
She launches into a fierce critique of the media and the established political landscape.
Her argument is that these issues aren't discussed, not because they aren't real, but because there is a profound enforced media taboo. She argues the media is not an objective observer, it is politically steered.
And to prove this mechanism of media bias, she gives a very specific comparative example involving two politicians.
Right.
First, she mentions Conor Rousseau.
Yeah.
And just for our listeners who don't follow Belgian politics, Conor Rousseau is a highly prominent, young, charismatic, left-wing politician. He was essentially the golden boy of the Socialist Party.
Yeah.
Francesca claims that at one point, there was a massive media uproar, wall-to-wall coverage, over a purely hypothetical rumor that the United States might theoretically deny him a visa.
It was a story built entirely on speculative political gossip.
Exactly. Now contrast that intense, speculative media focus on a left-wing politician with the media's reaction to a very real, documented situation involving a politician from her own right-wing party, Philip de Winter.
Right. De Winter is a long-standing, highly controversial figure in Vlaams Belang.
And Francesca states that de Winter was actually formally banned from traveling to the United Kingdom by the British government. It wasn't a rumor, it was a diplomatic action.
And what was the media response?
According to her, essentially total silence. Crickets. She uses this discrepancy, the massive amplification of a left-wing rumor versus the suppression of a right-wing reality as the smoking gun. It's evidence of the media's agenda-setting power. They decide what the public cares about by selectively choosing what to amplify and what to ignore.
And she shares a personal anecdote that drives this feeling of elite media disconnection home even further.
Tell me about that.
She talks about messaging a specific journalist. This journalist runs a news account on Instagram for the VRT.
She is the Flemish public broadcaster, right? Essentially the Belgian equivalent of the BBC.
Exactly. It is the mainstream state-funded news source. So Francesca invited this journalist to leave the studio and go for a walk with her in certain specific neighborhoods of Brussels.
What was the point of the walk?
The intent was to show her the reality on the ground. She wanted to walk through the areas that illustrate the problems Francesca is warning about, the areas where it is dangerous to walk as a woman, where the cultural shift is visually and physically apparent.
She was basically saying, Don't take my word for it. Come look at the results of these policies with your own eyes.
Precisely. And the journalist's response perfectly encapsulates the alienation Francesca is trying to highlight.
What did she say?
According to the interview, the journalist simply declined the invitation, replying with something to the effect of, "No thanks, it's not necessary, I live in Brussels."
Oh. Francesca's reaction to the interview must have been,
Oh. It was one of sheer, exasperated disbelief. She says, "Open your eyes, it's terrible."
the implication being that the journalist lives in a safe, gentrified, elite bubble within Brussels, completely insulated from the friction of the working-class neighborhoods.
Exactly. It highlights a massive disconnect. The source material paints a picture of a general population whose daily, lived reality, the street harassment, the rapidly changing neighborhoods, the strain on local schools and hospitals is being completely ignored, minimized, or actively suppressed by the people who control the mainstream narrative.
And the original podcast hosts of Crack Pratt actually chime in here with a very evocative metaphor for this dynamic.
They do. They describe the current state of political media and mainstream politics as a pop and cast.
A pop and cast, which translates directly to a puppet show. It's a great visual.
It really is. They argue that the media intentionally highlights extreme performative polarization. They pit the fringes against each other in a highly theatrical, curated display of outrage.
Specifically to keep the general population divided, distracted, and tuned into the drama, rather than focusing on the structural decay happening behind the curtain.
Because, according to Francesca's numbers, the population actually isn't that divided on this specific core issue of migration.
Really? What are the numbers?
She claims that 8 out of 10 Flemings actually agree that there is too much mass migration, that the system is overloaded, and that Belgium is full.
8 out of 10. If that statistic is even remotely accurate, it points to a massive sociological phenomenon, often called the spiral of silence.
Yeah, explain that for the listener.
It occurs when a vast majority of people hold a specific view. But because the media and elite institutions constantly portray that view as taboo, racist, or socially unacceptable, the majority remains silent. They actually believe they are in the minority.
And she points out that other mainstream political parties secretly know this is true. They look at the exact same internal polling.
Right.
She mentions that the Green Party, for example, quietly dropped their aggressive open-door rhetoric in Parliament because they realized it was absolutely toxic to voters.
She claims these parties maintain the public taboo and refuse to act on the consensus out of fear of being attacked by the media or losing specific, highly mobilized voter blocs.
But, there is a glaring inherent irony in this entire segment of the interview, isn't there?
Oh, massive irony.
She is sitting there claiming that the media completely silences her movement, that her arguments are taboo, and that the reality on the ground is ignored. Yet we are currently analyzing her arguments based on a highly produced, long-form interview on a very successful alternative media podcast that reaches tens of thousands of people.
Isn't the very media landscape she is critiquing already shifting completely beneath her feet?
That is the exact irony. But to be fair, the source material actually acknowledges this shift.
So?
Francesca notes that while she is rarely, if ever, invited onto classical television media for a fair debate, there is a massive rising counterwave.
Like podcasts and YouTube.
Exactly. She points to the very existence of podcasts like Cracked Prot and the explosion of alternative media sources on social media as proof that people are actively bypassing the traditional gatekeepers.
She views this alternative media ecosystem as a sign that the public is finally waking up, turning off the mainstream puppet show, and actively seeking out the unvarnished truth without the elite filter.
So, if we look at the journey so far, we have traversed the personal anxieties of a mother, the demographic spreadsheets projecting a 2044 tipping point,
The economic theory of a collapsing welfare state.
the cultural friction of winter markets, and the critique of a silencing media landscape.
We finally arrive at the most crucial, actionable part of the source material.
Yes, the solution.
If the situation is truly as dire as she claims, if the ship is sinking, what exactly is her proposed solution? In the interview, she mentions having championed a book containing 116 specific, actionable solutions to halt mass migration. What are the key structural pillars of her plan?
Well, her ultimate overarching policy goal is stark and simple. It isn't just about slowing things down. She wants to reverse the flow entirely.
Reverse it.
Yes, her goal is to achieve more immigration than immigration. She wants a net negative flow of migrants.
Wow. And she breaks down several intense mechanisms to achieve this, right?
She does. Let's start with her stance on deportation. because she anchors it in a very specific, aggressive statistic regarding the Belgian justice system. She claims that 40% of the entire Belgian prison population is comprised of non-Belgian nationals.
40%. And just for statistical context, she notes that non-Belgians only make up roughly 14% of the total national population.
Right.
So an overrepresentation of that magnitude in the prison system is a massive red flag for her.
Absolutely. And her solution to this is direct and uncompromising, active, mandatory deportation of these criminals back to their countries of origin.
She argues that a society simply cannot function, socially or economically, if it imports criminal elements, pays to incarcerate them, and then allows them to remain in the country after their sentence is up.
The friction here, which she acknowledges is difficult, is the geopolitical mechanics of deportation.
Because it's not always easy to send people back.
Exactly. Often the countries of origin refuse to take these individuals back, or the individuals destroy their identification papers so they can't be deported.
So what's her answer to that?
She argues that diplomatic pressure, including withholding foreign aid, must be used to force compliance from those countries.
But her deportation policy doesn't just stop at convicted criminals sitting in a jail cell, does it?
No, it goes much further.
She also addresses the much broader, much more complex population of undocumented illegal immigrants living in the country.
During the interview, the hosts bring up Donald Trump's use of the ICE agency, Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the United States, and they note that Trump is now floating a rebrand to NICE.
Right. The hosts essentially ask her, is that American approach too radical for Europe? Should Belgium have an agency actively hunting people down?
Her response is highly nuanced within her specific ideological framework. She states that the manner in which ICE operates in the U.S., the optics of it, the sometimes brutal execution, is often too harsh.
Okay.
However, she fully, unequivocally supports the core concept of establishing an active, dedicated police force whose sole mission is finding and deporting illegal immigrants.
She claims there are roughly 200,000 illegal immigrants currently living in Belgium.
That's a huge number for a small country.
200,000 people undocumented, untracked. And here is where she makes a massive pivot. She actually uses a humanitarian argument to justify what sounds like a massive, draconian police sweep.
It's quite a spin.
How on earth does she frame hunting down 200,000 people as the humane option?
She argues that it is fundamentally inhumane to allow 200,000 human beings to live permanently in the shadows of society.
Think about the mechanics of being an illegal immigrant in a highly regulated European state, right? Because they have no legal right to be there, they cannot get a legal job.
They cannot sign a legal lease.
They don't have a tax number.
Therefore, she argues, they are forced to survive through one of two ways. Either they are exploited in illegal, under-the-table labor,
which depresses wages for native workers and drains the state treasury because no taxes are paid.
Exactly. Or, out of sheer desperation, they are forced to turn to the illicit drug trade and street crime.
She states that the Belgian police are highly trained, much better trained than American police, and can conduct these searches in a professional, humane manner.
But her overarching point is that leaving 200,000 people in a permanent, exploitative state of illegal limbo is deeply cruel to the migrants themselves and structurally destructive to the host nation.
The only moral solution, in her eyes, is to find them and send them back.
This brings us to the logistics of how people arrive in the first place, because you can't solve the illegal immigrant population without addressing the entry points.
Right.
The source takes a very harsh, clinical look at the human smuggling economy. Francesca notes that migrants are paying exorbitant sums to criminal cartels to arrange the crossing into Europe.
She cites figures of 10,000 euros per person. When you multiply that by thousands of people, the business of human smuggling is a multi-billion-euro booming illicit industry.
And here is where she makes one of her absolute most controversial, incendiary claims in the entire interview.
This one is intense.
She turns her attention away from the cartels and aims her critique directly at the humanitarian NGOs operating rescue ships in the Mediterranean Sea.
These are organizations whose stated explicit mission is to pull drowning people out of the water.
But Francesca accuses these NGOs of being guilty of perpetuating the very crisis they claim to be solving.
To understand this claim, we really have to look at the concept of moral hazard and the cold, grim macroeconomics of the smuggling business model.
Let's analyze the smuggler's operation. The cartels charge massive fees for a highly dangerous product: illicit transport across the Mediterranean to European shores.
If they put people in unseaworthy rubber dinghies and those boats sink and everyone drowns, the smuggler's product fails.
The risk is incredibly high, which theoretically should suppress demand.
Right. If you know the boat is going to sink, you don't pay the 10,000 extra.
Exactly. But Francesca argues by actively patrolling just off the coast of North Africa and systematically picking up these unseaworthy boats, the NGOs entirely remove the risk of failure from the smuggler's business model.
They guarantee the smuggler's product delivery.
She literally calls the NGOs a free ferry service. Her argument is that the cartels now intentionally use terrible boats with just enough fuel to reach the NGO search and rescue zone.
Knowing the NGOs will finish the journey and bring the human cargo to European shores.
Therefore, she argues, the NGOs inadvertently ensure the illicit smuggling trade continues to boom.
Let me push back on that logic for a second because it is an incredibly dark utilitarian calculus.
It is very dark.
You are essentially saying that her argument is
Mm-hmm.
the humane, systemic thing to do is to pull the rescue ships back, let the risk of mass drowning remain exceptionally high, and eventually the demand for the smuggler's product will drop.
That is the implication.
It prioritizes the dismantling of a macroeconomic business model over the immediate individual lives of people currently drowning in the water.
It is a brutal calculus, prioritizing systemic deterrence over immediate rescue. She argues that the presence of the rescue ships actually lures more people to their deaths by encouraging the crossing in the first place.
Moving from the Mediterranean to the mainland, she applies a similar systemic critique to what she identifies as the absolute biggest, most structural driver of migration overall.
Family reunification.
This is a crucial mechanical point. When one legal labor migrant arrives in Belgium, say, someone who is highly educated, gets the job, and is actively contributing to the economy under current law, they possess the legal right to apply to bring their immediate family members over to join them.
This is known as chain migration.
And she claims that the math on this is economically devastating. She argues that one single worker often brings 2 to 3 family members who are not active in the labor market.
Think back to our breakdown of the welfare state earlier.
The resort.
Yes, the resort. You get one person paying taxes, but you instantly get 3 or 4 people utilizing the subsidized schools, the healthcare system, the public transport, and the infrastructure.
She views family reunification as the primary unchecked mechanism that guarantees migration remains a net massive loss for the welfare state.
She advocates for severely restricting or entirely abolishing this right.
Which leads perfectly into her final urgent warning in the interview. A warning about a mechanism that supersedes everything we just talked about.
The European Migration Pact.
Which she notes with alarm is slated for implementation into national law on June 12th.
To understand why she is so furious about this pact, you really have to understand the tension between national sovereignty and the European Union.
It's a huge source of friction.
A pact made in Brussels by the EU isn't just a suggestion. It dictates binding directives that override local national laws. It forces member states to comply.
She points out the political hypocrisy here. She notes that the current Belgian government campaigned on and promised the strictest migration policy ever to appease the voters.
Yet, behind closed doors, they are preparing to implement a European pact that essentially strips away their ability to enforce those strict policies.
Her critique of the European Migration Pact centers on a perceived, deeply unfair two-tier justice system.
She claims that under this new mandatory European agreement, member states like Belgium will be legally forced to provide newly arrived asylum seekers with guaranteed housing, cash handouts, and free legal representation to fight their asylum cases.
She asks a devastatingly effective rhetorical question to the audience here. Do you, the regular taxpayer, have the right to a free lawyer?
It's designed to hit a nerve. If a Belgian citizen gets into a legal dispute, they have to pay out of pocket or navigate complex systems.
She uses this to highlight what she sees as a structural injustice. The system is forcibly extracting taxes from the native citizens, only to provide guaranteed luxuries, housing, and legal resources to newly arrived non-citizens.
Resources that are entirely unavailable to the people actually funding the system.
She promises to fight the implementation of this pact tooth and nail in the parliament. But she acknowledges to the host that once it's an EU directive, it's an incredibly uphill battle.
So if we step back, take a breath, and look at the entirety of the architecture we just explored.
Yes, let's synthesize this journey. We started with a very intimate, personal fear. A mother worried about her children's future, a young woman navigating street harassment.
feeling of friction so intense it caused her to break out of her societal harness, completely upend her career, and hide her new political life from her own family.
We then followed her logical progression as she translated that personal fear into macro-level mathematical spreadsheets.
Projecting a literal demographic collapse of the native Flemish population by 2044, and explaining the specific economic mechanics of why an open-border welfare state is mathematically bankrupt.
We explored the complex cultural friction. We looked at the subtle erasure of Christmas markets, and we unpacked that massive paradoxical argument where she positions right-wing nationalism as the true, necessary defender of progressive women's rights and LGBTQ plus freedoms.
Defending them against imported religious conservatism. We looked at her claims of a biased media running a theatrical puppet show to distract a public that, statistically, largely agrees with her core thesis.
And finally, we examined her cold, systemic solutions, prioritizing mandatory deportation, treating humanitarian NGOs as logistical accomplices for criminal cartels,
Restricting the math of family reunification, and fighting supranational European pacts that she believes fundamentally betray the native taxpayer.
It is a comprehensive, highly interconnected, and incredibly potent worldview. And here's the takeaway for you listening right now.
Regardless of whether you agree with every single word she says or if you fundamentally abhor her entire platform, examining this primary source in this level of detail is incredibly valuable.
If you want to understand modern European politics, you cannot just read the headlines. You have to understand how these arguments are constructed.
You have to see how they successfully connect a mother's personal emotion on a street corner to massive macroeconomic theories of the welfare state.
This narrative is driving elections across the entire continent.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to mull over. Towards the very end of the interview, one of the podcast hosts introduces a fascinating philosophy for observing all of this chaos.
He calls himself a zoomer out.
He says that if you just look at the daily news cycle, it's just endless, deafening friction and noise. Outrage over a tweet, panic over a specific policy.
But if you zoom out over a timeline of the last 20 years, you see a deliberate pattern of constant, exhausting crisis and division.
He quotes the famous cynical political saying, "Never waste a good crisis."
He points to the constant grinding arguments over demographics, the intentional media bias, the endless cultural clashes over values and identity, the perpetual economic strain on the working class.
And he poses a question that we want to leave you with today. When a society is locked in this kind of perpetual, chaotic division,
when we are arguing endlessly over the very fabric of our identity, our safety, and our resources,
if you zoom out past the daily noise, past the political puppet show, past the spreadsheets and the rhetoric,
who is actually profiting from all that division?